Dry-aged beef is one of those luxury items that you see on menus at steakhouses. These steaks are pricey, but the fans, they swear every bite is worth the cost. Here's the thing though, you could buy a reasonably priced steak and recreate those flavors in just hours at home with this. Let's start with why people love dry-aged steaks before we get to why they're so expensive and how to make those flavors at home. Dry-aged steaks cost 40 to 100% more than regular steaks. Producers will tell you that dry aging makes steaks exquisitely tender and that it concentrates and enhances beef's natural flavor, that it gives you the ultimate steak experience. Now, we all know the difference between tough and tender, but what does that flowery, kind of vague language about flavor mean? To me, a dry-aged steak tastes like beef plus. Sometimes there's a minerality, a faint liveriness that you might have tasted in a blade steak. Sometimes there's like this blue cheesy vibe or some nuttiness or mushroomy flavors. And every time there's lots of umami. Getting those qualities, it takes time and attention, and that's what's driving up the cost. To dry-age beef, they store it in a temperature and humidity controlled room, and they'll leave it there for 2 weeks to maybe 2 months. Over that time, all sorts of things happen that change the flavor and the texture of the meat. Let's start with what we can see. The meat's surface, it dries out. Its color deepens and molds grow on the surface. Now, the longer it dry ages, the more gnarly that appearance. Beneath that crust, there's a bunch of activity that we can't see. There are naturally occurring enzymes in beef called proteases, and they get to work on the proteins. You can think of them as scissors. Now, imagine this garland is a protein in the beef. Proteins are just chains of amino acids. Given time, the enzymes are going to go in and snip the proteins into smaller pieces, and this has a bunch of really powerful effects. That snipping action of the enzyme scissors, it shortens the proteins, and that's just going to tenderize the meat. The longer a cut is dry-aged, the more tender it becomes because the enzymes have time to work. The resulting shorter chain proteins, they're called peptides, and the single amino acids, they all have a role to play too. Some amino acids, famously glutamic acid, amp up umami flavor. Others, like lysine or tryptophan, they're used up during Maillard browning, so when you sear or grill your steak, they're the ones contributing rich colors and roasty flavors. After the beef is fully aged, the dried out and moldy parts, they get trimmed off. To minimize waste, producers take into account the amount of time the meat had to be aged, the amount of weight lost to trim when they calculate the cost of a steak, and that's why dry-aged steaks are really expensive. Dry aging isn't practical for us to do at home because beyond the time and equipment you need to maintain the ideal temperature and humidity, it's just wasteful to do with an individual steak. You lose a lot to trim. As for cooking, you can use your preferred method. I'm going to cold sear this one. You can check out my episode on how to cold sear a steak for all the details on this technique. All right, I gotta try this. Salt. This is so intense. It's got this really lovely mushroomy savoriness to it, maybe like a little hint of minerality. I love it. It's great. If you've never tried a dry-aged steak, here's what you need to know. The longer the meat ages, the more tender the steak and the funkier the flavor. I think it's a good idea to choose something with less age if it's your first time. It's going to be less expensive and the flavors will be interesting and easy to pick out, but not overwhelming. For more details, you can go to americastestkitchen.com to check out Steve Dunn's article on dry aging. Now, if you don't have the cash, you could buy a more affordable steak and recreate all of those flavors using this. I want to take a moment to tell you about our Essential membership. It gives you access to all of our recipes, product reviews, and step-by-step videos. Cook Mode is really great for those kind of tricky steps. There are just some recipes where it's really helpful to have a visual, and with Cook Mode, you can watch the video to see exactly what I mean. Try it out for free by downloading the America's Test Kitchen app or going to americastestkitchen.com/YouTube. This and this, they're koji. It comes in a lot of different forms, and it's been used in Japanese cuisine for centuries. If you've ever had miso or soy sauce or sake, then you've had food that was made with koji. Koji is prepared by inoculating cooked rice with aspergillus molds. These molds make 3 classes of enzymes: proteases, amylases, and lipases. Amylases are enzymes that snip carbohydrates and cut them down into smaller compounds. Lipases, these are enzymes that snip fats and oils. And proteases, we talked about those. They cut proteins. The proteases produced by this koji acts on proteins in a similar way to the enzymes found in beef. Remember, those are the scissors that cut large proteins to create smaller ones and amino acids. To put those enzymes to work, we need to turn this into this. This is shio koji. It's a mixture of water, salt, and koji. In fact, shio means salt in Japanese. You make it by stirring together those ingredients and letting them hang out at room temperature for about a week. The exact time is going to depend on the form your koji takes, the ratio of salt to water, and the ambient room temperature. Once it smells right, you move the shio koji to the fridge and it'll keep there for months. And it can be used on all sorts of things. Tim Chin's got a great recipe that you can find on the America's Test Kitchen app or at americastestkitchen.com. The process of making this, it kind of reminds me of maintaining a sourdough starter. You got to go in and stir once a day. Now, if you've killed a bunch of starters or you want to get cooking right away, you can purchase prepared shio koji. When I'm looking to purchase shio koji, I go to Japanese or Korean markets and I check the refrigerated section. It's usually right by the miso. If you are buying shio koji, remember to check out the ingredient list and try to avoid brands that are made with sugar. In tastings, my team really preferred the unsweetened stuff. We also preferred shio koji to liquid shio koji. That's this. They make this by taking shio koji, using a little bit more water, and then decanting the water so that it's all liquid. It's just not quite as clingy and thick, and so we found this stuff was easier to use. The thing to keep in mind when you're using shio koji is that it only acts on the bits of meat that it's in contact with. So to get the most out of your shio koji, you want a steak with lots of surface area. A good amount of marbling also helps. Super lean cuts, they end up tasting really livery, and that flavor is kind of an acquired taste. Ribeyes, New York strip steaks, skirt steaks, or even hanger steaks, they all work great. But for my money, a flank steak is ideal. As you can see, this flank steak has a ton of surface area. These steaks are also easy to find and relatively affordable. There is one bit of prep that you can't skip when you're using a flank steak, and it's removing the silver skin. Now, doing this is simple. You just need a sharp knife. Something that's really thin and narrow is going to make your job easier, but really it's the sharpness that matters most. The silver skin is this whitish stuff that's on the surface of the steak. It's kind of between the fat and the meat in the areas where there is fat. Getting rid of the silver skin is really important because it's super chewy. It causes buckling when you go to sear the steaks. And critically, in the case of koji, it prevents those enzymes from touching the meat. And if they can't touch the meat, they can't do their thing. So to do this, I want to take my knife and I'm just going to slip it between the silver skin and the meat. We're only going to take off a little bit at a time. You never want to try to take all of it off in one swath, but you cut this way and that creates this little tab that you can hold onto. You want to lift up gently and then you're just going to slide your knife along between the meat and the silver skin and it should come right off. If your knife is sharp, it's just going to glide along. If it isn't, go sharpen your knife. But one other thing that helps is like a gentle sawing motion. It'll mimic what a sharp knife can do automatically. After trimming, I like to quarter the steaks to make them into more manageable pieces. This makes the searing and serving easier. So these are ready to koji. Now, I like to use about 1 tablespoon of shio koji per 8 ounces of meat, which means I'm going to need 3 tablespoons of the stuff for this steak. Make sure they're evenly coated. Okay, these are ready to go. If you want, you can also add other flavorings to this to make it a little bit more flavorful. I played with a bunch of combinations during testing and landed on 3 that I think you should try. Worcestershire sauce, garlic and pepper, bourbon, soy sauce, and allspice, or red wine, shallot, and thyme. So I'm going to wrap these up and pop them in the fridge. They're going to hang out in there for anywhere between 2 to 24 hours. You can find my recipe for shio koji steaks and the details on how to make those marinades on the America's Test Kitchen app. While these are hanging out in the fridge and the enzymes are snipping away, the salt is getting to work too. Remember, shio koji also contains salt. The sodium and chloride ions, they season the meat, they change the configuration of the proteins beneath the surface, and that keeps the steaks juicy and tender during cooking. Though if you really wanted to, you could let that steak hang out for 2 days. Just know that the more time that the koji's enzyme scissors have to work, the more pronounced the flavor change. 4 hours is a safe bet if this is your first go with shio koji. Besides dry-aged flavor, shio koji creates a lot of the starting materials needed for browning. So much that if you try to sear those steaks, the outsides are going to burn before the inside cooks through. Here's the best way to cook a koji'd steak. A reverse sear is the best way to cook steaks that have been treated with shio koji. That's where you gently bring the internal temperature up to whatever you want to serve it at and then sear it to finish. Now, before we start cooking, I want to wipe off the excess marinade and then season with pepper. I want to wipe off this marinade because it's just going to burn when I go to sear these steaks, and that's no good. And then my setup for the reverse sear is the usual rack inside a rimmed baking sheet. That just helps them cook really evenly. Now, these are going to go into a 300-degree oven, and it's going to take about half an hour for them to come up to 130 to 135 degrees. I like this slightly higher temperature. It's a little bit past medium rare because flank steaks are actually more tender when you cook them a little bit more. Skirt steaks and boneless short ribs also fall into this category. But if you really wanted to, you could take them to 125. A little bit of pepper. We don't need salt because the shio koji has all the salt in there already. All right, so I'm gonna wash my hands and pop these in the oven. Now that these have come up to temp, I want to give them a quick sear in the skillet. Now this goes fast. It takes maybe a minute per side. So the nice thing about this is it browns so quickly, the oil doesn't have to be smoking. I'm just looking for like the hint of a shimmer. All right, here we go. I like to serve this with a couple things: flake salt, lemon wedges, and a shio koji compound butter. There's just some herbs in there. You can use whatever you've got. I've got chives today, and it's fantastic with this steak, but it's pretty much fantastic with everything. Roasted veggies, grilled fish, you name it. Just gonna throw a couple of pats on. A little salt. And a nice squeeze of lemon. I actually like lemon with a lot of steaks, but especially here, it's so salty and savory. A little bit of brightness is really nice. The flavors here are so good. They have all of that rich, savory nuttiness that you'd get in a dry-aged ribeye, except this is a flank steak. It costs a lot less, and it happened in a couple of hours. It's like a magic trick. I'm just gonna eat steak now, guys.